They found the file inside a rusted steel cabinet on the lower deck of a decommissioned depot ship, wedged between forgotten maintenance logs and a mold-eaten chart of the Arctic Sea. No cover, no title, only a stamped line across the first page. Most secret operation source, not to be discussed outside Admiralty signals, destroy after reading. The pages beneath it were brittle, eaten by damp air and stained with salt, but one sentence remained perfectly clear, untouched by time. 6 craft, Midget submarines, odds of survival, negligible, odds of success, microscopic. This was the story of an operation that should never have worked, a mission that the Royal Navy described as suicidally improbable, launched during the dark years of the Second World War when the Allied command was being pulled apart by crises on every front: Africa, Italy, Russia, the Atlantic. A moment when the success of one small strike deep in occupied Norway might alter the whole balance of naval power in Northern Europe. The target was the Tirpitz, the largest and most dangerous battleship the Germans had ever built. Sister to the legendary Bismarck, armed with 8 15-inch guns, protected by armor thick enough to shrug off bombs, torpedoes, and near misses. She lay hidden in a narrow fjord in northern Norway, shielded by mountains, fog, air defenses, anti-submarine nets, patrol boats, and a naval garrison that knew she was the Reich's most valuable surface asset. The British called her the Beast of the North. Churchill had another name: the ship that must be destroyed. Because as long as the Tirpitz survived, every Arctic convoy carrying supplies to the Soviet Union sailed under the shadow of death. Even the rumor of her presence forced convoys to scatter. Her guns could cut an Allied cruiser in half. Her speed allowed her to strike without warning, and her armor made her nearly impossible to sink using conventional air attack. She was the German fleet's ultimate threat, its queen on the northern chessboard, and she had to be crippled. But nothing the Royal Navy tried had worked. Aircraft couldn't penetrate the fjord. Torpedo bombers couldn't get close. Long-range raids suffered from weather. Submarines couldn't pass the anti-submarine nets, the minefields, the listening posts. The Tirpitz seemed untouchable, until someone at the Admiralty proposed a weapon that looked more like madness than strategy. A submarine barely 50 feet long, built for 2 or 3 men, powered by electric motors and designed to crawl along the seabed under the noses of the German Navy. They were called X-craft, tiny attack submarines equipped with detachable side charges, explosive warheads weighing 2 tons each. Each X-craft would sneak beneath the battleship, drop its charges underneath the hull, and retreat into the dark, hoping to escape before the timed fuses detonated. There were 6 of these craft assigned to Operation Source: X5, X6, X7, X8, X9, X10. Their operators were called canoeists, human moles, and more rarely, the men who knew they were not coming back. In the months before the mission, engineers and divers trained around the clock, mastering the X-craft's controls. These were submarines unlike any other. Claustrophobic, unstable, liable to leak, easy to flood, prone to mechanical failure. They required surgical precision to operate. Steering was done with a bicycle-like control column, depth maintained by manual valves, oxygen balanced by constant adjustment. One mistake would kill everyone aboard. But the men selected were volunteers from the Royal Navy Submarine Service, young, disciplined, and fully aware that their mission might be a one-way voyage. Every one of them signed a document acknowledging that the probability of extraction was extremely remote. Training took place in Scottish locks designed to mimic the Norwegian fjords. The men learned to navigate underwater by touch and instinct. They practiced cutting through nets, grounding the craft on the seabed, and operating in silence. They rehearsed attaching the massive charges beneath mock hulls. and they endured hours, sometimes days, inside the steel coffins of their craft, relying on rebreathers and sheer willpower. As the summer of 1943 waned, preparations intensified. The tide of war was shifting. The Allies had landed in Sicily. The Eastern Front raged, but Hitler's Northern Fleet remained a fleet in being, a force whose mere existence tied down thousands of men, dozens of ships, and entire squadrons of bomber aircraft. Churchill demanded action, and so, in early September 1943, the X-craft were attached to large fleet submarines that towed them across the North Sea toward Norway. It was a brutal journey. The tow lines snapped repeatedly, seas surged, the tiny craft bucked like insects behind the larger submarines. Some crews nearly drowned after water forced its way through the hatches. X-8 was damaged beyond repair when its side charge started leaking chemicals. The decision was made to scuttle it before it endangered the mother submarine. The crew fought tears as they abandoned their craft. They knew the mission depended on numbers. X-9 was lost entirely. Likely the tow line snapped, pulling the submarine down by the bow, dragging the crew to the bottom of the Norwegian Sea without a single distress signal. They vanished instantly. That left four Midget submarines to infiltrate the most heavily defended harbor in northern Europe. 4 fragile machines to strike a ship weighing more than 50,000 tons. On the night of 21-22 September 1943, the remaining X-craft, X-5, X-6, X-7, X-10, detached from their mother submarines. Their commanders shook hands with the larger crews, knowing it was the last time they would see friendly faces. They submerged and vanished into the black water. Ahead lay fjord, narrow, treacherous, and closed by sheer cliffs that amplified every sound. The Germans had layered defenses like a fortress: anti-torpedo nets, anti-submarine nets, floating booms, mine barriers, patrol boats, listening devices, and floodlights mounted on the mountains. The Tirpitz herself was moored like a trapped beast behind this labyrinth, guarded by destroyers, anti-aircraft guns, searchlight crews, and infantry. Her hull blended into the darkness. Her armor made her invincible, unless the British could get underneath her. The approach into the fjord was slow and excruciating. The X-craft had to pass under nets weighted to the seabed, slip through gaps just inches wide, and avoid detection by hydrophones sensitive enough to hear a frog kick in calm water. X-6, commanded by Lieutenant Cameron, encountered mechanical failure almost immediately. His periscope fogged, his compass jammed. The craft bumped into underwater rocks, creating metallic thuds that echoed through the fjord. But Cameron refused to abort. He forced the craft forward, scraping across the seabed, maneuvering through the nets by instinct and nerve. X-7, under Lieutenant Place, advanced with terrifying precision. He found gaps where none had been expected, threading the craft through underwater barriers in near total silence. X-5, whose role has always been clouded by mystery, attempted a different route. German lookouts reported spotting a periscope wake near the middle net line before depth charges were dropped. X-5 was never seen again. X-10, plagued by mechanical trouble, became too damaged to risk an attack run. Her commander made the agonizing decision to withdraw, preserving his crew for future operations. That left only 2 X-craft in attack positions, X-6 and X-7. Inside the claustrophobic hulls, condensation dripped from every surface. Batteries crackled, oxygen thinned. The operators sweated as they hand-trimmed their depth, inching forward in darkness. Hours passed. The men were exhausted. Their eyes burned from the battery fumes. But then, as dawn crept into the fjord, something changed. The interior of the X-craft glowed faintly red. A shadow had passed overhead. They had reached the Tirpitz. Cameron in X-6 stared through the murk at the underside of the largest battleship afloat in European waters. Her hull extended like a steel cliff, a submerged mountain. They had no room for error. He maneuvered slowly forward, heart pounding, until his craft bumped lightly against her belly. Above him, German sailors walked the decks, unaware that a British submarine no larger than a truck lay directly beneath them. X-6 released its first side charge. The weapon sank and settled on the seabed close to the battleship's keel. The second charge followed. Cameron then tried to retreat. But the X-craft was trapped. The nets had shifted. The craft's motors jammed. Its ballast valves stuck. He ordered the crew to scuttle the submarine and escape. They opened the hatches and swam upward into the cold fjord water, surfacing beside the astonished Germans. Place in X7 had managed to reach another position beneath the Tirpitz. His charges were set even closer. He slipped away, attempted to escape the fjord, but was discovered, depth-charged, and forced to bring the crippled craft to the surface. He and his men were captured. By mid-morning, both surviving X-craft crews sat aboard the Tirpitz as prisoners. The Germans interrogated them, asked if their charges had been placed, asked where they were. The officers refused to answer, except for one cryptic warning. You may wish to evacuate the compartments below. The Germans didn't believe them at first. Then the clock rolled toward 8:12. A tremor rippled through the entire fjord, then a second cavern-deep explosion. The Tirpitz leapt upward as if struck by an invisible hammer. Everything not bolted down flew through the air. Steel plates buckled. Machinery sheared off its mountings. Bulkheads fractured. Water burst through the lower compartments. The battleship, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, nearly tore herself open. Her turbines were wrecked, her electrical systems crippled, her fuel lines shredded, her magazines flooded. Tirpitz was not sunk, but she was paralyzed, rendered useless for the rest of the year. Repairs would take 6 months. Germany's northern fleet had lost its apex predator. The British prisoners, bruised and dripping seawater, were marched past the destruction, escorted below decks as German sailors frantically tried to stem the flooding. Many glared at them with a mixture of hatred and awe. One German officer whispered to Cameron as they passed, "You have achieved the impossible." The aftermath changed the course of the naval war in the north. Without the Tirpitz threatening convoys, the Arctic supply line to the Soviet Union experienced a window of safety. The British High Command exhaled for the first time in years. When news reached London, though heavily censored, Churchill declared, "The Midgets have struck a mortal blow." The surviving X-craft crews spent the rest of the war in German captivity. The men of X6 and X7 were later awarded the Victoria Cross. The others, those who died inside the lost submarines, were quietly honored in the pages of naval history, but their names seldom reached the public. The full report remained classified long after the war. It described the mission as a triumph of endurance, innovation, and voluntary sacrifice. It recorded how fragile the X-craft were, how many technical failures nearly doomed the plan, how narrow the margins were at every stage. But it ended with one simple line. The Tirpitz was crippled. The enemy's northern war machine suffered a decisive blow delivered by 6 boats that should not, by any rational measure, have survived the attempt. In the cold waters of Kofjord, the wreckage of the X-craft still lies, small rusted shapes on the seabed beneath where the battleship once loomed. The fjord is quiet now. The mountains watch in silence. But the story endures in the steel bones of the craft that crawled into the heart of a fortress, carrying men who knew their chances were nearly zero, but who went anyway. This was not a large battle. It was not an invasion or a bombing campaign. It was a handful of young men pushing fragile machines across an unforgiving sea into the jaws of one of the most heavily defended anchorages in Europe. A mission no one expected to succeed. A blow that echoed across the entire naval war. A story written in cold water, silence, and bravery at the edge of endurance.